Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear Madina Tlostanova, I'm really very happy to welcome everybody here at the continuation of our biennial program of the fourth edition of the Kyiv Biennial titled Allied, which is curated this year by the newly initiated interinstitutional organization called the East Europe Biennial Alliance, and it's actually the fourth edition, which is organized by the Kyiv-based Visual Culture Research Center, which I represent. My name is Vasil Cherepanin. I'm here also with my colleagues Katerina Nikolenko and Alexandra Zaitseva, who are helping us with the technical side and live streaming this event via our Facebook page. So to start with, I have to stress that actually this year's edition, we, in spite of all pandemic odds, we mainly conduct in a physical form at our biennial venue, the House of Cinema. So this event of tonight is basically one of the two scheduled online events on our biennial program. And I'm indeed very happy and super grateful to you, Madina, that you have accepted our invitation so kindly and agreed to take part in the biennial program. So yeah, we are very happy to welcome you, at least virtually, at our biennial. And also for the public, some methodological technical note from the organizational point of view with regards to the format of this event. So we will have a talk by Madina for around 50 minutes, and then it will be followed by a Q&A session for around 20-25 minutes. So also a general request to all the public, we are collecting the questions and your comments. You can leave them on our Facebook page where this event is being live streamed. And also those who joined us on the Zoom platform, you can leave your comments and questions in the chat section, writing directly to everybody or to us with my colleagues personally. So we will also collect those questions and ask them, some of those after the talk itself. And also, just a general request again, please don't forget to mute yourself during the talk itself. And then you can, if you want to ask the question afterwards, just use this option to raise virtually your hand, and we will pass the floor to you. So I am very happy to welcome again everybody at the event titled The Age of Unsettlement, Possible Paths Towards a New Political Imagination by Madina Tlostanova. So my pleasure to introduce you, Madina, who is a decolonial thinker and fiction writer, professor of postcolonial feminisms at Linköping University in Sweden. Madina focuses on decolonial thought, particularly in its aesthetic, existential, and epistemic manifestations, feminisms of the global south, post-socialist human condition, fiction, and art. Her most recent books include What Does It Mean to Be Post-Soviet? Decolonial Art from the Ruins of the Soviet Empire, published by the Duke University Press in 2018, and A New Political Imagination, Making the Case, which she co-authored with Tony Fry, published just pretty recently last year. So the topic today will revolve around basically two concepts, as we already mentioned, the concept of unsettlement and also the idea of the need, rather, of this new political imagination. So, and before I leave the floor to you, Madina, I just have to say that, and to stress here really from pretty much institutional point of view, as I already mentioned, that this edition is being curated by biennial edition by the East Europe Biennial Alliance. So I basically, from this point of view, I share pretty, so to say, this kind of institutional vision or perspective on the topicalities and the matters that you are going to talk about tonight. It's just really very important to emphasize that It's a pretty new interbiennial initiative, this East Europe Biennial Alliance, which was launched only 2 years ago. And basically, it's very important also to say here, within this context of our today's talk, that it was created out of the sense of emergency, I would say, as a need to make, to build up a kind of a safety net of the cultural institutions in the region in order to follow a kind of a survival strategy in a way. So when I go through the description that you proposed of the problematics that you will discuss today, it really like very much embraces the very conditions actually why this whole East Europe Biennial Alliance came into being. So I would pose at the very beginning a very general question to you. So when you will be talking about unsettlement as really such a general condition which includes indeed so many worlds of those of refugees, of the socialist bloc, of the peripheries of the global south, and which also implies a very specific so-called catching up temporality, right? So the basic question and the most important sort of practical use, I would say, with regards to this topicality is what kind of new agency, new institutional agencies can be envisioned via this new needed political imagination, and what are those possible alternative alliances and collaboration practices, right, which we need today, and where there are those examples of such collaborations in the past, perhaps maybe rejected for some reason. And at the very end, why Eastern European region is so much specific and promising in that regard. Thank you so much again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vasil. It's my pleasure and my honor to be talking today. And of course, I would much prefer to be talking in Kiev in reality, but unfortunately not this time. I hope sometime in the near future it will be possible. Actually, it's very good that you set the tone of this conversation by posing these questions. So I will try to engage with some of them while I'm giving this talk. But let me start with an anecdote that refers to this weird encounter that I had during the pandemic, and for me pretty much now summarizes this idea of unsettlement and its new phase. It will hopefully set the tone also to our discussion of unsettlement. I cannot forget my visit to the university campus in the summer of 2020, when it was still difficult to buy surgical masks and to find pulse oximeters in Sweden, and COVID testing was very rare and hard to organize. I walked into the campus with its newly built enormous building, housing the student center, auditoriums, the library, and predictably found a completely empty campus, as we were in the work from home mode at that point. I crossed the beautiful apple garden and almost crashed with a very strange thing, with a pink driverless bus that is being routinely tested on our campus roads. The driverless bus was completely empty. There was no people there. It was brightly lit. Its indicators reacted to my movement, and the bus abruptly stopped to let me pass while continuing to loudly announce the names of the stations, basically to itself in a very cheerful and mechanical voice. Then I noticed that 3 meters behind me, there was a couple of wild rabbits or hares maybe that froze and looked attentively at me and at the bus. I started crossing the street, and these rabbits, they also hopped along. And soon they, of course, left me behind and hopped towards the IT department. And I felt very, very strange at that point. I felt this weird kinship with the rabbits that I mentally called the Displaced Mammals Alliance, in a shrinking space that was overtaken by technologies of this bus, you know, the robots and all that. The pink driverless bus in a COVID-devastated campus and also in a COVID-devastated country somehow was an epitome of technocratic euphoria and a clear indication of its severe limitations for me. And so a lot of work that I've done since then is connected with this kind of rupture that has been made especially clear, I think, during the pandemic. Despite the growing inequalities and new forms of dehumanization and dispensability of lives, most living beings on this planet are marked today by an overarching sense of unsettlement, so that we can say that we live actually in the age of unsettlement, negotiating between belonging and non-belonging, rootedness and displacement is one of the core understandings of the global crisis. In the last decade, this sensibility has acquired additional overtones, additional meanings. Unsettlement has turned into a certain leitmotif of life in the crisis as such, which is manifested on many levels, indeed, on ontological, existential, affective, material levels. While the most clear examples would be the climate change, or if we look at geopolitics, it's wars and catastrophes-induced massive migration of people that's going to grow soon. But also the unsettlement of increasingly precarious lives of people, of even those who seemingly are okay. I mean, the people who seemingly stay in place and do not migrate, but still they more and more frequently feel this unsettlement of being in between, of not belonging neither here nor there, not only spatially, but also in points of temporality. The pandemic has enormously accelerated and intensified this tendency, leaving most of people feeling unsafe and unhomed in the most ordinary sense, and previously secure situations when they are just in their families, in our homes, in the streets of our cities, among our friends. We all feel unsettled, of course, to different degrees, different extents. The turning of unsettlement into a major leitmotif has intensified in the recent decades, eroding borders of the nation states, creating an illusion of the boundless world for certain privileged groups until quite recently, but also bringing only endless fences and barbed wire for others. The malevolent context of the increased unsettlement includes the conditions that we called with Tony Fry in our book, the post-peace, post-democratic conditions, commercialization of all spheres of life and its dispensability indeed, and also a very peculiar thing, which is like a fear to realize the movement of time and the finiteness and fragility of the kind of existence we built for ourselves, and not only for ourselves, but also for other species. And as a result, it leads to an inability to imagine actually a different world and start working for its implementation. It is largely a lacking understanding of interconnectedness of all aspects of this major crisis we inhabit. And this is a very dangerous thing, because this crisis is already altering our nature as humans. Of course, especially politically, but also in many other spheres, we see a fitful grasping of isolated elements of being bio-inept in the relational thinking, because this is what we are taught at the knowledge productions institutions at the universities. We are taught a derelational thinking, which is unable to understand, to even start understanding the complexity and relationality of the world. One example is, of course, this technological coloniality, which is often presented as a way of salvation, whereas in reality, technologies are also the key agents in altering our human being, our human ontology, and the disease then is mistakenly prescribed as the cure. Unsettlement then is an existential condition, first of all, that is paradoxically shared by the most and least privileged. It embraces not only the lives of migrants and refugees, the former second world, if we can use this term, who are left in the void still, but also multiple beings, human and other, whose lives are being destroyed by the climate change and broader by what is usually addressed as the Anthropocene, so that unsettlement becomes indeed a global condition of displacement that shatters any previous essentialist interpretations of belonging, which usually, of course, in modernity are connected with the nation state and the national identities. We experience this pluriversal condition of unsettlement, of course, very, very differently, depending on our own trajectories, privileges, disadvantages. Yet we, to some extent, share it as a leitmotif of ultimate defuturing. That's another concept I would like to maybe use and introduce here, defuturing, because we tend to still link the feeling of safety with belonging to some place, to some space, to some community, land, group thinking. Until recently, public culture, politics, mass media tended to regard unsettlement as a very limited problem of various outcasts that can be easily, solved through effective management. The leading mood remained that of the chronophobia, I would say, the fear of time, refusing to face the unsustainability of the current dominant conditions that Donna Haraway addressed as the Capitalocene rather than Anthropocene. So it's a specific lifestyle with its endless race for growth, race for progress and development for the sake of consuming more and more. The negative face of globalization coming to its crowning apex today as a result of the pandemic also threatens to fold the world, I would say, into another digital slavery mode, where coloniality would finally stop to be seen as a problem of particular groups of people like colonized or refugees, migrants, indigenous people, and would stop to be just a fashionable term of the academic elite and to confront directly each and every. And unsettlement then allows to connect the material level of the imminent global movement of people, cities, businesses in the coming decades of this century due to the climate change, due to unsustainable economies, geopolitical conflicts and wars, but also, and maybe more importantly, the existential effects of this resettlement of people leaving them or leaving us with no sense of the future. It names a moment in human being, in human existence, that recognizes an ending which has no clear sense of what is beginning. And that is probably the main meaning of unsettlement. Along with this goes a certain feeling of foreboding that will arrive and will be unwelcome. Because as such, life is lived in ever-expanding conditions of being uncertain, of uncertainty in general. The slow existential realization of this situation heralds the coming age of unsettlement. And confronting this age extends from seeing it unfolding in the present state of the world to it being kind of lived as condition directed by a state of mind and also experienced as a state of mind. So it's also a psychological condition. This brings us to the crucial temporal dimension of unsettlement. The leitmotif of unsettlement is a pervasive chronophobic sense of defuturing, of temporality that is literally out of joint, to use Shakespeare's metaphor. The word unsettlement seems to be referring more to the idea of space or its lack or the loss of space and connection to a space, a process or a result of displacement, of losing a stable and clear connection to this space that traditionally, of course, has given humans a sense of protection, however fleeting and arbitrary. And yet, if we remember Shakespeare's play where this idea is formulated, the out of jointness, and it's a famous Hamlet's phrase. Hamlet speaks of the disjointed time and dreads that it's him who must set it right, as if he was speaking of a broken clock. And through mixing these two metaphors, merges or translates ontology into chronology as an exclusive common denominator of modernity. And Hamlet's out-of-jointness, as Gilles Deleuze pointed out long ago, is likely refers to a specific confusion as a result of which time stops to be subordinate to and measurable by human movement, human action or perception, which are, of course, culturally, politically, historically, and morally contextualized, biased, and he breaks free, dislocating its links with the thinking and percepting subject, with the thinking and percepting I. And so this disjointed time, or as he says, wild time, then escapes the anthropocentric dimension used to tame it before. It is Shakespeare's reflection on the difficult relations between Chronos and Kairos, if you wish, resulting in the infamous Hamlet impasse and lack of action, yes, which suddenly brings us back to today, to contemporaneity, and our own fear of time as one of the persistent leitmotifs of the first decades of the 21st century. If in Hamlet, the temporal conflict is between the cyclical, nature-driven and traditional Chronos that becomes disjointed and the new historical, human-driven and potentially evil time of Kairos, a certain lapse from temporal virtue. In today's world, the Kairos of modernity is disjointed along with the Chronos that has changed its nature, is changing its ontological nature. The current temporality is, of course, disjointed, among other things, because late modernity betrays its own initial impulse of linking time with movement, with perpetual movement, which, of course, in modernity has been understood as progress, as betterment and development, of reaching an ideal of social utopia that replaced the previous religious eschatology. In the near or distant future, this was the main pattern, so to say, used in modernity. Falling out of the progressivist teleology then leaves humans barren and confused, as the sense of accelerating time is accompanied by a slowing down in human psychological, physical, and cultural processes. No doubt, humans in this context is a very arbitrary and artificially constructed universalist concept. Our difference and diversity are officially recognized and supported in mostly positive terms today, while the everyday reality, of course, is still, if not more, marked by xenophobia, while the darker, unspoken consequences of the diversity of inequality are seldom even discussed as a potential threat for the unity and integrity of the human species. Yet life in this later phase of neoliberal modernity, or even more, maybe specifically, the air of the time, no matter what position we occupy in it, that of the harshly exploited and dispensable lives, that of the thoughtless consumers, or those who attempt to combine both and move from the first group to the second, obviously shares some similar disturbing features that cannot be accounted for with just social explanations or just economic explanations. What is clear is that the disjointedness of time is paradoxically a common disease of the global north, of the global south, and also of what is in between them, or what is left in the void and has no voice. The darker side of modernity is no longer translated and transported into other geographical spaces that are said to be living in their own times, moving with their own speed, but rather it's specking the texture of modernity in its very centers with cracks and interstices of other temporalities. Therefore, perhaps the clearest example of unsettlement comes, of course, from the refugees as a persistent sign of the age of unsettlement. They are subjected to a strange temporal war, waiting for their fate to be decided forever, taken out of the flow of life, sometimes for years on end, when the actual term of their life on earth is somehow stolen, and they can never be sure that they would not be finally deported back to the hell from which they attempted to escape. Until recently, it was precisely the refugees and previously, if you remember, some of you, the terrorists that acted as the most obvious signs of disaster exempt from any political action or space, robbed of time, and functioning not as agents of their own empowerment, but only as, I would say, emblems of their own suffering, and at times also aggression and threat, or in Frantz Fanon's words, phobogenic subjects who stand below the symbolic, which makes them invisible beyond perverse anonymous objects, the meaning content of the dream, the phobogenic reality, to quote Louis Gordon. They literally embody the fears of Western modernity and are to be conveniently tucked away somewhere as they are naturally visible and at the same time publicly invisible, exempt from any political action, any political space, or the space of appearance, to quote Hannah Arendt here this time. Today, this human condition threatens to become more and more all-embracing. Before the pandemic, catastrophic capitalism has already renaturalized the war ethics, justifying our collective permanent loss of freedoms under the excuse of fighting the consequences of various catastrophes, natural, geopolitical, and technological. The normalization of the state of exception, often induced by the dual state, has already started turning every citizen into some kind of potential threat needing to be monitored and disciplined. So in that sense, unsettlement acquires additional shades. The situation with climate or water refugees is different from the more familiar geopolitical and clearly military conflicts and causes of mass migration in the recent past. This is the geopolitics of mere survival, I would say, the grim reality of forever barren territories, useless for habitation and agriculture, of vast and previously densely populated plains flooded by the rising ocean, has no use for political casuistics to define the degree of democracy in different regimes. Instead, it magnifies the situation of their survival as such, unconnected to political preferences, at least in any straightforward way. This kind of unsettlement downsizes and humbles the humanity to its more realistic dimensions and accentuates both the new forms of inequality and the new ways of solidarity, which are very, very difficult to implement. The COVID crisis has acted as the epitome of these tendencies, erasing the boundary between the old and new, wretched of the earth, and those who had an illusion of being relatively safe and having some kind of future. So diasporic, exiled, migrant, stateless, and nomadic people, as well as internal others living in various townships, ghettos, reservations, of course, have existed for millennia, but what is collapsing right now is the modern colonial normalization of the properly rooted citizen, as opposed to the unsettled outlaw. One does not even have to travel or be a migrant to become unsettled and dehumanized. It's enough to be confined in your apartment, for example, as a futureless prison with no way out, to find out that you're COVID positive and therefore a new outcast. We have all become unsettled in a sense overnight, as we were brought to face the crisis of legitimacy of the evacuated politics, the nation state, international unions, institutions, and bodies that have nothing to offer but a permanent state of exception and the coronavirus capitalism, to use Naomi Klein's words. As an enormous abscess on the body of the world, modernity with its distorted temporality becomes inflamed and infects the bloodstream and all the tissues, threatening to kill the whole organism, so that there is indeed no safe space left in the world. But the festering of the late modernity from inside triggers its previously hard linear temporal scale to rot and soften, so that it loses the clarity and precision of its former outlines. The privileged global North consumers who used to know exactly where their future vector was pointing to are starting to feel this treacherous rotten softness, and to experience firsthand the unpredictability of the bending curves and temporal folds of the limbo in which the world have been forced to puddle for over 3 decades. These conditionally privileged subjects are not fallen into the past, but rather like Hamlet, they're caught into a temporal paradox. in which the visible acceleration of time, the flickering of life, is directly linked to the hollowness, to lethargy and aimlessness of human existence, with its underlying lack of any hope. So that hopelessness becomes the main trope of today, of contemporary life, the true meaning of the cancellation of the future and the anachronistic temporal disjuncture which is marking our lives. In some way, the pandemic is a form of suspended future. However, the reasons for this getting stuck in the Neverland are, of course, different from both the situation of the end of history, eternal status quo consumerism of the present, whose unsustainability we have refused to acknowledge, and from the helpless void of refugees and illegalized migrants, whose future is clearly questioned, or let's say mortgaged, again to quote Frans Fanon. It's partly explained by the inexplicability of the COVID, which is equally invisible and inconspicuous as the climate change, but acts many times faster and lacks a clear teleology. It's hard to blame someone concrete and specific for the pandemic. The uncertain but clearly rather distant future of the planetary catastrophe has suddenly been brought very close to us, or putting the humanity into the conditions of fast and grim realization of futurelessness. In this sense, it's not only the COVID itself that we are increasingly fearing, but more so the world we are entering after the crisis is over. It's the world in which unsettlement will become the key sensibility for nearly everyone, a negative community of sense, of feeling unhomed in your own body. Ironically, locked immobile in our houses, cells, barracks, diligently staying home, we quickly found ourselves with no ground underfoot and with no hope to find this ground in any foreseeable future. The point is not just that we will not be able to travel, meet with friends, or hug our loved ones. The point really is that these seemingly harmless restrictions, if they go for sufficient time, will clearly affect our basic anthropic, biosocial, and psychosocial parameters, affects emotional structures, ways of communication, and proximity to the world and to other humans. The necessity of revisiting and revising these basic ontological features of our humanness would not doubt intensify and accelerate the already started changes as we are becoming a fractured, fragmenting species with a changing ontological nature. But the pandemic is really only the tip of the iceberg, of course. Still, after almost half a century of the gradual invalidation of time, it's hard to come to terms with the cancellation of the future, as Bifo Birardi wrote in one of his books, The Horizon, because time and its durational and directional dimensions is what helps humans make sense of our lives, and the loss of time's movement equals our loss of meaning. In temporal terms, unsettlement is expressed in the fact that people are thrown out of the previous time paradigm without being able to enter a new one. However, the endless future is present, fixed on the past, and an inability to imagine a different option that triggered Mark Fisher's and many other recent books seems to finally come to an end due to the pandemic. Not that humanity is really learning much, but this global disaster has acted as a catalyst, dividing the people not just into the privileged and disadvantaged, but also into those who are able to imagine a different world, and those who prefer to hide behind the idea of normality and status quo. In the looming post-pandemic reality, there will be no doubt many people who will nostalgically cling to the empty shells of the recent past and mundane normality of the frozen futureless time that would seem not so bad after all. But this normality is gone and will never come back. And the pandemic, in fact, has acted as a final push, ushering us into the 21st century and offering the openings into various futures that we can reject or fulfill, thus eliminating the desynchronization, which was pointed out by Fisher, between our sensibility of time and the cultural, social, economic, and environmental realities. These openings into other futures are likely to be contesting and aimed at overcoming the trope of suffering and salvation, and rejecting the coming back to normal logic in which salvation is still predictably looked for in technologies, in religion, or in the market. The pandemic has acted as the mysterious Godot in Beckett's play, inducing the same sense of being nailed to a limited space and immersed in a viscous, still time, the trope of pointless and endless waiting for a miraculous shift of the world back to order, back to normality. In his later plays, as we remember, the motive of immobility would be intensified in the disturbing scenes of characters confined to garbage cans or sinking gradually underground. Paradoxically, this immobility and forcible rootedness are the epitomes of unsettlement, more existential in Beckett's case and equally biophysical in our case today. The pandemic has made it palpable that we have entered an end game, but a very strange one that can continue and stay suspended for a very long time. It's easier for our minds to make sense of the world and ourselves through some recognizable narrative, mythic narrative, with clear good and evil characters, and a no less clear moral maxim in the end. But the simple narratives of good conquering the evil or glorification of hard work and self-sacrifice are no longer valid. And we have to try to find the ways out, invent an alternative lexicon and teleology without appealing to these familiar means. In the new semiosis of unsettlement, many people are facing the extreme vulnerability as freedom, including the freedom from material belongings and corporeal and affective connections. In the situation of normalized unsettlement and defuturing, an open question is what kind of new communities of sense, to quote Rancière, will be born out of this condition? Would it potentially lead to a new solidarity and empowerment of local communities and the eventual birth of a new political imagination? Should we try to reinstate the old normality that has created the crisis to succumb to the new normality imposed by the nation states, international organizations, political institutions, extending the end game in passé and confinement for an indefinite time? Or maybe focus on other ways of re-existence and networks of resources for building the communities of change. The first two options can be defined as negative designs, negative ontological designs, to quote Tony Fry. The third one, which I believe in, is yet a subjunctive modality, a subjunctive mood modality of new political imagination and agency. This doesn't mean that we will try to restore the human-sized and human-centered world. Rather, it means that we try to use our human abilities, including critical thinking and technologies, as well as relational practices grounded in a realization of our unity with the world, for advancing the sense of responsibility and efforts to save the life on our planet in all its forms, and cooperate rather than compete to survive. It's hardly possible to put the time back in previous order, but we can stop believing in the better future and prepare for the worst times to come and realize that in this situation, we need to try to make this worst come later and alleviate its consequences, most probably not even for ourselves, but for the coming generations. That thus accentuating another important loss in the social texture of late modernity, that of intergenerational links and responsibilities. For that, we need to stop seeing ourselves as victims, negotiating a better affirmative action, or as masters, oblivious to anything outside our own lifespans, to become rather nurturers of re-existence, redefinition and resignification of life in conditions of dignity, a praxis of the otherwise. And here I'm quoting Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignola. To initiate what has been called by Maria Lugones, a decolonial feminist, deep coalitions. Deep coalitions, they never reduce multiplicity. They span across differences, aware of particular configurations of oppression. They are not fixed on them, but strive beyond, as she says, into the world towards a shared struggle of interrelated others. This is a task we are collectively confronted with, no matter which side of modernity coloniality we inhabit. This test cannot be confined to the position of the colonial difference. It must necessarily include the imperial differential as well as other post-dependence, human conditions and sensibilities, forming the future positive ontological design that will balance between the comfortable delusions and eschatological recklessness, and engaging in a complex, critical, relational reflection of the world. The question is if the unsettlement can indeed generate this kind of new transversal relational solidarity beyond the bankrupt institutions and power structures, if it can launch new communities of change, which would also change ourselves as humans. To my mind, art and fiction seem to be more nuanced, immediate in their reaction to these shifts, and able to imagine unsettlement as not only a negative, but also as something opening new possibilities, and most importantly, triggering an evolvement of a new political imagination that would make refuturing possible. The unsettled, anxious, and disturbing protagonists, the in-between subjects, human and other, who reside neither here nor there, who leave the predictable and dead past for the sake of the living transnational and transmodern present that they hope to also refuture, inhabit these spaces of unsettlement as options. They strive to overcome the immobilizing locality of continental ontologies and national ontologies, and the modern colonial predicament, the bleakness of the looming world of total surveillance, but also inevitable self-limitations instead of thoughtless consumption and growth. Their re-existence would have to be a collective action, a collective non-individualistic endeavor, changing the mode of narration, representation, visuality, and understanding of the self, the world, and also a new political imagination towards refuturing, to refuturing. These communities of change grounded in unsettlement would have to make it into a positive design for the fragile world, for the unstable world, and for the humbled human who would have to learn how to make this immense and boundless, scarred and injured world into a communal home again. These coalitions can build on the forgotten and erased cultural, historical, religious, linguistic, cosmotechnical, cosmological links that do not necessarily coincide with normalized modern colonial ideological binaries and borders. This doesn't mean going back to some constructed archaic traditions, but rather exploring the paths of alliances and collaborations that were indeed discarded and disqualified by modernity, thus dooming many nations to forever remain in the semi-peripheral catching up mode. Before it can arrive as a communal effort, a new political imagination and a new agency needs to do a very important critical memory work for refuturing. And one of the most promising and interesting regions in this sense is undoubtedly Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Southeastern Europe. The two interrelated modern colonial myths that it has to overcome to be able to start imagining other futures are the victimhood rivalry and the promised belonging, or the idea of Europeans under probation. The modern colonial human taxonomy continues to use agonistics from the word agon as a rivalry, as in victimhood rivalry, grounded in divide and rule principle as its most efficient tools of keeping populations at bay. It's assumed that everyone must take for granted the existing hierarchy where we are all assigned specific places. Yet people are falsely promised that it's possible to actually improve their place through progress and through development. Agonistics goes hand in hand with the forever promised and constantly postponed or conditioned belonging, so that joining the European Union or raising their status there once they joined it is often dangled as a carrot in front of the whole countries, enchanted and re-enchanted with this ghost reward. Although more and more often we witness reactions against this type of disciplining and specific European forms of double consciousness that, in contrast with the racial Du Bois original, are based on the gap between the imposed ideal European image and internal unresolved contradictions that at once prevent from completely merging with this ideal and serve as a source of pride and difference. Once again, several imperial and colonial, as well as geopolitical and ideological narratives clash in these complex inter-European entanglements that often lure the smaller countries into playing the role of model minorities through rigorously following all the EU requirements in their strive to outwest the West, which nevertheless doesn't guarantee, unfortunately, acceptance or inclusion. On the other hand, various others discarded from Europe, forbidden from entering and joining it, of acting as its unwanted internal others, are also infected by this victimhood rivalry, by a peculiar urge to take advantage of European belonging or association, yet take no responsibility for European politics in the past or in the present. Many East European and Southeast European moves are examples of this latter attitude. A litmus test, for example, is their treatment of refugees, or rather refusal to deal with them. Victimhood rivalry keeps people under the universally accepted agonistic principle, compete or perish, not allowing them to question this logic and refuse to compete for a higher place in modernity or for the status of its victim. Typically glossing over their own recent colonial status, the East and Southeast European states often attempt to cling to the real Europe once again in the role of its equal participants rather than internal others. Whereas the ugly stories of the past, for example, the colonial atrocities, are left to remain on the consciousness of this very old Europe, but not its recently joined members. Thus, the East and Southeast European opt for the lighter side of Euro-modernity and refuse to deal with its darker side, both their own and someone else's. Similar unreflected upon complexes are typical for the borderlands and European semi-periphery that to survive plays, let's say, on multiple boards at once. Yet the roots of these conflicting sensibilities are, of course, imperial colonial once again. A mutual fear of outcoming and incoming migrants and refugees is evident in the complicated issue, for example, of Bulgarian and Romanian EU membership and their non-membership in the Schengen Agreement. What is at work here, of course, is a complex combination of the peripheral European refusal to deal with the possible massive migration from outside the EU, but also a concern of the increasing outward migration of the citizens of countries like Romania or Bulgaria to Western Europe, which is already at an extreme rate due to work migration, seasonal and more permanent. The core European countries in both cases have a familiar deceiving combination of democratic and inclusive rhetoric and the hidden strategy to diminish the inflow of Eastern and Southeastern Europeans, or for example, Georgians into the Western Europe in any capacity but seasonal and service workers with no rights and no benefits. Therefore, the old logic of model behavior for probational Europeans or prospective Europeans is unfortunately still at work. Most EU and individual countries' decisions for the migration problem are not functioning and could not work because they are still grounded in othering, dehumanization, or alternatively progressivism, assimilation, integration, as the official rhetoric goes. But the question is, where should these newcomers integrate? The fact is that the growth of nationalist populist rhetoric hides the quickly eroding and dissolving idea of national identity in most European countries. The combination of failing economies that cannot accommodate people under just and humane conditions, the realization of larger and larger groups of immigrants that no matter how hard they try to assimilate will never be accepted on equal terms or have equal rights in respective nation states, is potentially creating more conflicts in the present and in the future. And these conflicts are threatening to grow into uncontrollable and impossible to suppress by prison, police violence, and detention centers. According to many prognoses, in the coming decades, the scope of migration will expand many, many times, as dozens of millions of climate migrants and Anthropocene migrants will join the political and economic migrants of today. So tomorrow, even with the technological surveillance advances, humanity would have to face a challenge when millions of people with no homes and means of survival will start moving uncontrollably at once. Meanwhile, now there's hardly even such a status as a climate refugee. the existing system of detention centers and other forms of incarceration that become the main waiting zones for refugees for years to come, the draconian border control and deportation mechanisms, as well as no less flawed system of coercive integration into nation states. More and more sizable parts of the population are going to be immigrants soon, cannot and will not work and needs to be dismantled. Victimhood rivalry grounded in agonistics can be overcome only if there is a collective will to solidarity and transversal coalitions, values that were discredited with and in the beginning of the early 90s, when it had become clear that the state cannot be decolonized or democratized, so that both anti-colonial and socialist utopias were left behind. If these values are not soon revamped, but on a different basis, delinked from the failed utopias of the past and more attuned to the challenges to face in the near and distant future, there is little hope that the current complex crisis will be alleviated or slowed down. When we try to imagine the future communities of change, it's likely they transverse the arbitrary boundaries of the concept of Europe, giving way to other coalitions as it used to be before Euromodernity, and is bound to happen again in some other form. Borders drawn along artificial lines and dissecting the living flesh and blood age-old zones of cultural, economic, and social cohabitation and interaction are and will be negotiated and problematized, whereas the erased and smothered rich transcultural phenomena, context, traditions might turn out to be actually more fitting for survival and sustainment in the future than both the neoliberal global and the nationalist local frames. This process of deflating Europe to its true scope, zooming in on its heterogeneity and dividedness into several very different areas, each with its own external links and pools, actually erodes the European fortress walls and accentuates its centrifugal tendencies. So I do believe in these regional bottom-up transversal communities of change and redirective action, such as elimination, unmaking, remaking, repair, striving to bring a future under their own control that can potentially emerge in Europe, and especially in peripheral and semi-peripheral European spaces already in near future, cancelling the top-down division of the European spatiality that fails to provide a sustainable future for most of its inhabitants. Such communities would arrive of necessity in the situation of gradual degrowth and post-development. Many of them could originate in the economies that were marginalized by free trade agreements, in the local communities excluded from mega regions as a result of the climate change impact on agriculture and aquaculture systems, due to the fact that robotic technologies in countries with advanced economies with large domestic markets increasingly displace the use of cheap human labor in semi-periphery and periphery. So these are just a few examples of this survival and refuturing initiatives that could be grounded in a carefully reconstructed bank of local, indigenous, and various transcultural technologies and cosmologies that will have to be transnational and considering primarily the larger ecological, economic, social, cultural complexes rather than artificially constructed nation states or top-down EU divisions. So a possible new European vision would have to balance and negotiate a self-critical humbleness with an impulse of designing alternative communities of change that would be grounded in a situated praxis as a dialogue between the always problematized European premises and the reconstituted and broadened to a more direct dialogue with contemporary challenges, foundational communities. Of course, in the present complex crisis, Europe needs to start realizing that this is its future. And to sum up, to finish, let me remember, out of all people, the semiotician Yuri Lothman, who said many years ago suggested to look at the border not as something bad, not as a set of negative excluding mechanisms, but as a translating mechanism, as a translating machine, and a space of intense semioticization and metaphoric translation transformation, a space where multiple and profuse new texts and new meanings are being generated. So the current European fortress system is not supportive of such understanding of borders, of course, but it does not have to stay like that forever. The obvious failure of most European political institutions and cultural policies at various levels would trigger a revival of the positive interpretation of the border in this Lotman's Dean, and one of its possible realizations can be the regional transnational bottom-up communities of change. Such communities are likely to develop as border spaces between the North and the South, including the European internal North and South, between core and periphery, the privileged and the disenfranchised in different combinations, in which another agency, another life, another economy, another political imagination, and also another future can be launched and sustained. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. If you were in a physical space, we would have here a warm round of applause. Yeah, so thanks so much, Madina, for this beautiful political as well as poetic, I would say, expose that you just shared with us. And also, again, a kind reminder for all the public, especially those who joined us on Zoom here, please, if you have a question or comment that you would like to voice, you may use the chat section to leave your words there, or just use this option to raise your hand, and we will pass the microphone to you. So to start this Q&A session, I would like to ask you, Madina, first of all, in reference to, with regards to what you just mentioned, about those two myths that should be overcome, victimhood rivalry and this never realized promised belonging, right? Mm-hmm. So my question here is a bit maybe general, but I think this you are really like the right person to be asked about that. So the question is about the interrelation between post-coloniality and post-socialism. So I'm wondering here, how would you describe, and what's your take on this, about the applicability of the post-colonial or decolonial discourse in the post-socialist conditions? Because first of all, as we know, this post-colonial or decolonial discourse emerged and originated in a different political and ideological conditions. So it was transferred here in the post-socialist East European semi-periphery later, after being originated in a different context. So when it's been transferred here, how it can really work, and how can it be critically used for emancipative purposes? Because it's also, speaking here from the Ukrainian context, it's also pretty often being referred to as decolonial or post-colonial, but in a really very much nationalistic manner, I would say. It's pretty fashionable, especially under the conditions of the Russian-Ukrainian war, for instance, to emphasize here that all of our socialist past is not actually ours, that almost during the whole 20th century, we've been just occupied. Again, it's about this victimhood ideology, right? That we were just victims, so we don't have any moral agency in the past in that regard. So I'm also referring to the, in a way, to the book title of yours, right? Which is, I mean, what does it mean to be post-Soviet, where decolonial art from the ruins of the Soviet Empire? So in this sense, is it enough to call the Soviet Union an empire? Is it in general a legitimate way to approach the phenomenon of the Sovietness of this Soviet Union? So the problem here, especially in this context, is that coloniality is being associated with socialism as such, though from the very beginning it was totally the contrary, right? So I'm really curious about the current conditions and how this discourse of decolonialism can be used appropriately in the post-socialist conditions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vasily. It's a very complicated, complex question. And of course, I would only start maybe answering it. You are right, and when you question that, how applicable are these theories? I generally think that theories should not be applied in places where they don't belong, to tell you the truth. So in this case, we need to create our own theory, if you wish, you know, because it should be our voices and our sensibilities and our experience as these post-Soviet people, let's say, right, and post-socialist broader, who should talk about this. It shouldn't be the West coming and telling us what kind of life we had, and shouldn't be the Russians, and, you know, but this is the point. Another thing is that we should be aware of the connections also between these different theories, that they are not kind of formulated in the vacuum, that all of them are related actually to the geopolitics of their times. What I mean is that the post-colonial theory, of course, is a more clearly British story, because yes, it emerges as a result of this kind of outcomes of the British Empire, and that's why from the beginning until now, until very recently, it's very much still focuses on the classical sort of colonialism, which is considered to be British colonialism. And that's why for such a long time it just neglects anything else. I mean, you would never talk about the Russian Empire, for instance, the Tsarist Empire, or the Ottoman Sultanate, or anything of the kind, or the Habsburg Empire, for that matter. You know, it's always kind of neglected, which is of course stupid and very shallow, right? If you talk about this Eastern Europe, I mean, where do you put Austria-Hungary and all that? But anyway, the point is that the post-colonial theory in that sense, I mean, is not applicable. No, I mean, you can apply some of its beautiful metaphoric concepts maybe, but then it will be very misleading again, because even such favorite concepts as a subaltern, they are not applicable when you start speaking about Eastern Europe, when you start speaking about such unique cases as Ukraine or Belarus, for instance, because its relations with the colonizers, so to say, Russia and then Soviet Union is very different. It's very different. It's a story of itself, and it should be, you know, seen on its own basis. But when I speak about the colonial option, what is important here, and I think that until very recently, even decolonialists themselves didn't realize that, is that, yes, it also is very much connected with specific context of Latin America, right? And speaks, first of all, about the Latin American history, of specific history, including socialist history as well, but also including the indigenous history. So pretty much we can say that it starts in the 80s and early 90s with Aníbal Quijano, Peruvian sociologist, Marxist sociologist, as a reaction to the end of the Cold War. And, you know, not many of them realize that this socialism and the end of global socialism actually influenced very much the emergence of the colonial option. And that's why I said in my talk today that when we realized that the state cannot be democratized and the state cannot be decolonized, because this is from where the colonial option comes in Latin America. When they realized, like, after several decades of anti-colonial movements and post-colonial countries getting their independence, they were still not decolonized. There was still neocolonialism. There was still all of these assumptions of colonialism going on. So political independence did not automatically mean intellectual independence or cultural independence. So that's why the state cannot be decolonized. That's what they come to. And then at that point, Soviet Union collapses and the whole socialist system collapses. So that utopia also stops to be viable. And there is this pessimistic left, the global left pessimistic thinking of the 90s, you know, like, okay, so from now on, we just have neoliberalism non-stop. And of course, at this point, we realize that this utopia also didn't come to anything, right? So the end of history discourse, it's not true. History goes on. and maybe not the way it was predicted by Fukuyama. But the point is that this is where this decolonial option comes from, this collapse of the socialist utopia and the realization that post-colonialism is not actually post-colonialism, it's neo-colonialism. But you see, in this discussion, it's interesting that the socialist world and the voices of socialist people is not heard, is not present. Although the whole world starts to be post-socialist in a sense, right? After the collapse of the state socialism, we are not taken into account. We are not considered as producers of theory or producers of any kind of ideas not just for ourselves, but for the global kind of, use. And that, I think, is also shows you very, very much how coloniality of knowledge works, how in this new intellectual division of labor, we still don't have any space for ourselves, And that's why I would say that maybe in the colonial option, what we can take is not the concrete analysis of colonialisms, but rather this questioning of this very system in which all humankind is divided into this kind of groups according to their proximity to Western Europe or to whiteness or whatever, and according to this, we are granted or not granted the right to speak, the right to have our opinion, and the right not to just take a ready-made theory that was formulated elsewhere and apply it to our reality. And you are also right when you say that a tendency, a very kind of unfortunate tendency today is that many of anti-colonial, post-colonial and decolonial ideas that should be liberatory are used today by alt-right people, by nationalists, and it's very, very dangerous. And that's why maybe indirectly I was also criticizing the victimhood rivalry, because it's very much connected with, okay, I'm not interested in others. I just want to discuss my specific case of victimhood. And then there is, again, no trying to kind of go beyond this logic and not become independent in true sense, and have human dignity, but rather compete for these bits and pieces of, some kind of charity. And that is very bad, I think. And that's, again, how this coloniality of thinking and being works. Even when you can live in an independent country, it can have a statehood and all that, but still this kind of mentality is what is very dangerous, I think, for the future.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Now we've got a question from Anastasia. So please unmute yourself and make yourself visible and ask your question, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Madina, very much for your talk, and thank you, Vasil, for moderating this. I wanted to ask one question, but you raised a really interesting discussion about applying post-colonial scholarship to Eastern Europe and to Ukrainian case. And Madina said that, like, generally you wouldn't apply it. But I would like to ask you whether I agree that we should not apply, for example, British case to Ukrainian case, because that would be ridiculous. And but should we maybe think that the post-colonial scholarship, the neo-colonial scholarship has some blind spots, and maybe there are new forms, different options of colonial? And also in the Ukrainian case, as Vasil said, like, we should not be seen as victims because we're colonized by Russia. But when you study post-colonial scholarship, you realize that colonized people, they are not victims. They are not lacking voice. They are not lacking agency. So they are just, they're victims of circumstances, but they're still like agents with their voice. It just, they have no platform for their voice. So should we rather, because in my opinion, using post-colonial scholarship and applying post-colonialship with a lot of nuances and clarifications is really useful tool to sort of explain the post-Soviet and sort of find the place of a post-Soviet, and then to sort of find that connectivity with find our place in a global world, and even like within academia. So what do you think about that?
Thank you. I mean, of course, it's up to you. You can use anything you want.
No. I just because I studied this, and that's what the really interesting point. Yeah.
No, but I mean, it's up to you. That's why, I mean, theories are not prescribed anymore. Thanks God, right? So if it makes sense to you, why not? To me, it didn't make sense. You know, when I was 20 years old, the Soviet Union collapsed, and I started reflecting from this time, like how to make sense of this. Who am I in this world? And I tried different theories, and I got interested at some point in post-colonial theory, but there were too many blind spots there for me. Yeah. You know, that was my problem. And also, again, if you think about these situations that are not typical, like particularly Ukraine and Belarus, or the Baltic states, they don't fit into the picture. Why? Because the main category in any post-colonial and especially decolonial thinking is what? Race. And race is not sufficiently kind of reflected upon critically, I would say, starting now. But the racial denominators were not the main, if we speak about the colonization of Ukraine by Russia, for instance, you know, or then by Soviet Union. It was not the main factor that was used. It was much more complicated and nuanced than that, right? And that is, again, this is something that post-colonial scholars don't see. They are blind to this kind of nuances and these intersections that you find in the case of Ukraine, or especially in the Baltic countries. You know, that it's like a very paradoxical case, I would say, of the more Asiatic empire kind of, you know, going there and always having this inferiority complex also still in front of more European Estonians, let's say, something like that, right? So that is also very important to take into account. And again, that's something you don't find in post-colonial theory because it starts from the British Empire. I mean, but generally, yeah, why not? For example, if you talk about cultural production, if you talk about literature, or you talk about arts, this is where post-colonial theory is great, because this is what they mainly worked with, right? So they came up with really elaborate system of concepts, while, for example, the colonial option did not, because it works in a different area. It works with social movements rather than arts. So yeah, I mean, if it works for you, why not? I am kind of more hesitant now after doing this for many years. I think that we really need to start from scratch maybe and create our own concepts for that and come up and be more bold in that, you know, rather than trying to fit into the existing system that somebody created for us. And it's also interesting, you know, that there are a bunch of really interesting scholars who are not, they don't belong to post-colonial tradition formally, right? But they write about interimperiality, like several scholars. They write about interimperial relations. They write about different forms of nationalism and how they were developing historically. And they, interestingly enough, have really, you know, have been writing about this for many decades. And some of them actually also wrote about the Tsarist Empire as this kind of second-rate empire, you know, and its very difficult relations and forms of enforced Russification that, you know, were used, of course, in colonization of Ukraine and other territories to the west of Russia, let's say. So that is really, that's also interesting to have a dialogue with this kind of scholars that are not branded as post-colonial, but they were just quietly sitting there and doing their historical work, you know, but they know history better sometimes. And they are more aware of these differences than decolonial scholars or post-colonial scholars. So yeah, why not? Maybe you come up with some your own categories and concepts, like hopefully.
And also maybe as a follow-up to what we just discussed, with regards to the experiences of the socialist past, right? So how would you tackle this? Are there any kind of political modes, let's say, or collaboration techniques in this lost second world, right, which can be really used in this new type of decolonial thinking, and today can be really directed to some other purposes that we face today, or all those because you were talking about these defunct institutions, right, from the past. So I'm really wondering, can we really reappropriate in a way something from that experience, or these are just really totally outdated entities that should be left behind?
Thank you, Vasil. Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think that many people are asking it these days and are very hesitant about this. Yeah, it's a conflicting thing because on the one hand, there is still this reaction against many of these institutions. Why? I think because most of them were top-down institutions. Like in the Soviet Union, whenever there was a talk about solidarities, or there was always kind of created top down and then enforced. And it doesn't mean that people always followed it. No, there were real friendships, real collaborations, and real connections in spite of this. But I think that in general there is this skepticism coming from those who remember how artificial this people's friendship was, let's say, right? And this kind of enforced internationalism. But at the same time, we realize that it's necessary to have some kind of coalitions and to have some kind of solidarities. But I think that they should come maybe more as bottom-up activities. They should come from people themselves, from this maybe small groups, cells, or whatever projects. And it's already happening. I can see that in the last several years in Eastern Europe, there are a lot of organizations like that. And some of them are more social kind of movements, political. There's a lot of artistic connections like that, on the level of museums, on the level of different other small organizations, and even just people, doing it in social media and in Facebook or wherever, like it's amazing. People are really interested in having these reading groups and discussing different things. And what I like, again, is from a decolonial perspective, that it's not done only from the West to other places, it's like done not via the Western mediation, but sometimes directly. For example, between the global South and the semi-periphery, between the former Second World and the global South, or even within the global South or within the semi-periphery. So there is no authoritative figure from the West anymore who comes and says, okay, now I will explain what happened to you and you will have to follow my theory, which I think is very important. That it should be our problem to kind of make sense of what happened to us and where do we go from there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, please, we have a question from Oksana.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, please. Just please, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm a Belarusian citizen and currently live in Ukraine, Lviv, and doing my PhD in the United States, Rutgers University in art history. And spending during this pandemic a year in Ukraine and trying to research topics like in video art, for instance, I realized that actually here there is like access to kind of theory is very, very limited. And you talked about decolonization of knowledge a lot. And I wonder if, like, I see in art historical research that in Ukraine and in Belarus, art historians are usually locked and they are not having access to this larger theory and cannot use it. So they are not properly colonized in this way, in way of thinking about knowledge, right? And they kind of locked in their situation and not using this broader theories. So I just wonder how can they produce be bright and produce some knowledge if they kind of in some way in this cultural bubble still, because there is no access to material. So this is my big question. So it's difficult to be kind of think. And the second part of the question is that how can we start to produce knowledge from here if even you or Mignola and researchers who bring a lot of new ideas in the colonial thinking, in the colonial theory, they all are connected to Western universities, and kind of being located there and having access to materials, you kind of produce new knowledge as well. So what do you...
Thank you very much. This is a very kind of typical question that is asked a lot by young scholars who think that you have to be in the West to produce knowledge. I'm sorry, I am in the West for 6 years. Before that, I spent all my life in Russia, working in the most strange places and universities where whatever I was doing was banned. You know, and I still produced knowledge, I still wrote books, most of them published in English in the United States or elsewhere. So it's not really a question of where you work, believe me. Another thing is that I increasingly am skeptical about any kind of university as an institution. And I think that if I had a choice, I wouldn't be working at the university. I don't believe that it can be decolonized at all. You know, it has to be kind of closed and something alternative has to be made instead. And it concerns all universities in Belarus, in Ukraine, in the United States, anywhere. As an institution, as a colonial institution, the university, unfortunately.
With this.
Yeah. And the museum as well, unfortunately. So, but in museums, I think there are ways of going around, and there are kind of indigenous ways of doing it. I was not sure, I mean, what you mean. The fact that people don't read Western theory, maybe it's not bad that they don't read it. I mean, because, and then I don't think that we can think about art historians as somebody who are tabula rasa. They're not, because they got a specific education before they started doing something, right? They don't come just, you know, as some kind of, you know, people from the wilderness. But then, of course, the question is, what kind of education? Do you mean that it's not using Western theories? It's using what? Russian theories, Soviet theories? What sort of theories do they use? But still, this is also part of modernity. It's just a specific kind of text that they are, you know, reading and studying. But it's still part of the modern / colonial institution of learning. Because if you take the Soviet kind of art education, it was also part of modernity. Of course, it was a socialist kind of, you know, face of it, but it still had very much a canon, a specific way of looking at things, a specific way of deciding what is good, like a classical education is good, academic education is good, and then something is connected with folk art, for instance, was considered not so good. So there was a kind of but it's very much about the general modern colonial division into what is good arts and what is not, right? And what belongs to the sphere of art and what is just craft, for instance, or some kind of, you know. And so that is very much there. I mean, of course, it had a difference in points of ideologies, but the logic was the same as in the Western Museum. But at the same time, of course, there is a problem of not having access to maybe some texts that should be indeed translated and maybe accessible to these people. Although, you know, I sometimes find that what they have to say without reading the contemporary fashionable theories is much more interesting than many theorists write. So I wouldn't just dismiss them because they don't read contemporary theories, because I have a problem with contemporary theories. I very often think that art is more interesting, you know, than any theory.
I just say that it seems like going in circles, inventing a bicycle from the scratch when there is already existing the archaeology.
Okay.
Of knowledge, and this prevents from new ideas somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is, of course, yeah, that exists, yes, sometimes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Oksana. And if I may, there is also a question here in the chat section from Kirill Pashkov. I will read it out. So do you think that any desire to create a new utopia or theory to change society on such a scale inevitably leads to the displacement and alienation of people? Similar happens with EU or any other artificial structure, as by the time of a new institution takes place, it's not longer connected with the generations from which it arose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thus
Yeah.
rendering reactionism as the only viable counterbalance to the technological revolution we find ourselves in. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, yes, of course. That's a problem with utopian thinking in general, and that's why I think utopia should be left in the past in that sense. Because unfortunately, as we know historically, most of open utopias they ended up being closed utopias in the end. So they start as very much open and inclusive, but they often end being exclusionary. And that's what happened with many, I mean, starting with socialism. I mean, socialism on paper is a great idea, but then can you give one example when it actually happened the way it was on paper? That's another thing. Like, can we still work with this concept, and how? And what needs to be shifted or changed there to be workable? And the EU, yeah, but the EU is a completely artificial institution, of course. And that's what we were struggling with Tony when we were writing the book about the new political imagination. And that's what actually shocks a lot of our European peers, let's say, right? Because when we say we don't like your system of democracy, of course they are shocked, because you cannot say that in Europe, right? But what we mean really is that it's not democracy as a concept, is what it actually, how it actually functions today, right? And the fact that these very short electoral cycles lead to the fact that politicians are just interested in staying in power, and they think in those short terms, right? Rather than thinking of how to save, you know, for example, humankind, or how to change life, how to make sure that because of a climate change, we don't have a catastrophe in 50 years from now. No politicians think in those ways, because they are in a democratic system in which they think about this kind of, how can I be re-elected and how can I stay in power? So that's what I meant, actually, also speaking about this chronophobia and the fear of change and this status quo mentality, but let's not change anything, and this sort of nearsightedness of all of this politics. But that is a very slippery thing, you know, because you can go from here in many other different directions, and one of them can be very authoritarian. Of course, that's, you know, we have to be aware of this. And well, me and Tony, we are of course more anarchists. We are against any kind of state or this kind of political institutions that exist. And when we thought about the idea of communities of change, we pretty much thought about them in more anarchistic sense, I would say, than anything else.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I think it's a great note to end with, and I'm afraid we have to leave it there because we are almost out of time. So we are really very grateful to you, Madina, for this great talk. And also thanks so much to all the public for your attention and for your questions. I just have to announce at the very end that we are tomorrow back to our physical space, the House of Cinema. So please join us there at 7 p.m. For the talk by Agata Jakubowska and Magdalena Radomska. And our next online event will be on the 8th of November. Thank you so much again. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.